3 days before she died, Margaret took off her wedding ring and pressed it into Thomas's palm. Not the way people hand over jewelry for safekeeping, the way people hand over something that has somewhere specific it needs to go. She told him a name, a city, an address she had apparently memorized, reciting it without hesitation, the way you recite something rehearsed in the dark for a long time. Deliver the ring personally, she said, not mail it, not have someone else carry it. Him, in person, to a woman named Diane Foss, who Thomas had never heard of in 41 years of marriage. When he asked who she was, Margaret looked at him with an expression he had never seen on her face in 4 decades together. "I'll explain when you come back," she said. She did not live long enough to explain anything, and the ring sitting in Thomas's palm carried a weight that had nothing to do with its physical mass. Thomas had married Margaret in 1983, in a small ceremony neither family could fully afford, and he had spent the following 41 years assuming he understood the complete architecture of her life. Her childhood in Ohio, the miscarriage in 1987 they never discussed, but both privately marked every spring. The specific song she hummed when she thought no one was listening. He believed there was no significant chapter of her life he hadn't been present for. So when the name surfaced in her final week, unattached to any story he could locate in 4 decades of marriage, something in him reorganized itself around a question he had never once needed to ask. Who is Diane Foss? He held the ring through the rest of that week, through the quiet hours and the conversations too precious to interrupt with questions about a stranger he never got the chance to ask again. She slipped into something quieter than sleep on a Thursday morning, and the explanation she had promised went with her. What Thomas knew, sitting in the empty house 3 weeks later, was only this. His wife had carried this name long enough that it came out of her unrehearsed in her final days, which meant it had been rehearsed for years before that. And she had wanted him, specifically, to witness whatever this was, not delegate it, not mail it, carry it. By the second week, a thought had taken root that he was ashamed of and could not dislodge. A woman his wife had never mentioned in 41 years. A name spoken with that particular unreadable expression. An instruction that felt less like an errand than a confession. He told himself he was being unfair to her memory. He got in the car anyway, because the only way to silence the thought was to find out he was wrong. The town was smaller than he expected. One main street, a hardware store that had clearly stood there for generations. The woman who answered the door was perhaps 70, with sharp eyes that studied him for a long moment before either of them spoke. When he said Margaret's name, something moved across Diane's face that he recognized immediately, because he had been living inside the same expression for a month. Grief. Specific and personal, not the polite condolence face people perform for strangers. She invited him in. Thomas told her, with the bluntness of a man who had rehearsed this for 2 weeks, that his wife had died and had sent him here with her ring, and that he had no idea who Diane was or what she had ever been to Margaret. He braced for an answer he didn't want. Diane was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that erased his fear entirely and replaced it with something stranger. "Your wife saved my daughter's life." Thomas had no memory of Margaret ever mentioning a connection to any child who wasn't theirs. Diane explained, slowly, that 26 years earlier, her daughter Eliza had been a teenager in a crisis that hadn't announced itself clearly to the people closest to her. Margaret had been Eliza's guidance counselor for exactly 1 semester before Eliza transferred schools. 1 semester. She had noticed something nobody else had noticed in time, and she had intervened in ways Diane could only describe in fragments, her voice catching on details she still found difficult to access. Thomas felt the shape of the mystery shift entirely. This wasn't a romance. It was something else. A young woman, now presumably in her 40s, that Margaret had apparently saved and then, as far as Thomas could tell, never once mentioned again in 41 years. Why keep something this good hidden? And why send the ring now, decades later, to a woman she hadn't spoken to in years? Diane left the room and returned with a small wooden box. Inside, dozens of letters spanning more than 2 decades, addressed to Margaret in handwriting that wasn't Diane's. Eliza's handwriting. Thomas asked why he was only seeing this now. Why Margaret had never once mentioned receiving letters from a woman she had apparently changed the course of. Diane explained that Margaret had asked Eliza never to make any of it public, never to thank her in a way that would create a story. Whatever happened between them, she had said, stays between them. Thomas read several letters with Diane's permission. These were not letters from someone thanking a stranger for one good deed. These were the letters of a relationship that had continued, quietly and without acknowledgement, for over 2 decades. Birthday cards, college advice, a wedding. Congratulations that referenced details only someone who had stayed closely informed could have known. Margaret had maintained a relationship longer than most friendships Thomas knew about, built entirely outside his awareness. This did not resolve the mystery. It deepened it. Why hide something this consistently good for this many years from the man she told everything to? The answer came from a final letter near the bottom of the box, dated 8 months earlier, written in Margaret's own handwriting. Thomas recognized it immediately, and the recognition produced a specific ache he hadn't felt yet in this particular shape. Margaret had written to Eliza about something neither Thomas nor, apparently, Eliza had ever fully understood. She explained that she had insisted on privacy because of something from much earlier in her own life. She had grown up watching her mother's single act of kindness toward a struggling neighbor become a story the entire community retold for years, reshaped until the kindness mattered less than the telling of it. Her mother had eventually stopped doing the quiet good things she used to do, because visibility had changed what doing them felt like. Margaret, watching this as a child, had made herself a private promise. If she was ever in a position to genuinely help someone, she would never let the helping become a story. She would let it remain exactly what it was. Thomas sat with this and believed, finally, that he understood everything. Margaret had saved a teenager and built a quiet, decades-long act of devotion that she had protected from ever becoming about her own goodness. It felt complete. It was not. Diane, watching him absorb the letters, said something gently that reopened the mystery in a direction Thomas hadn't anticipated. "But that's not why she sent the ring," Diane said. Thomas looked up. Diane explained that the ring carried a separate and more specific meaning, connected to a single afternoon 18 years earlier that she herself had only learned about recently, after Eliza finally told her the full story as an adult. On that afternoon, Eliza had been at her lowest point in years, a crisis that had nearly ended badly. Margaret had driven 6 hours unannounced to sit with her. During that visit, Margaret had taken off her own wedding ring and placed it in Eliza's hand. She told Eliza the ring represented a promise she had made and kept for decades, through every reason a person might have to walk away from a commitment. "Hold it," she had said. "Understand what it means to keep a promise, even when keeping it is hard. Give it back to me only once you've found something in your own life worth promising yourself to." Eliza had kept the ring for 3 years. She returned it in person, at a small reunion nobody else knew about the year she got married. The ring Thomas was holding had already completed this exact journey once before, decades earlier, in the opposite direction. He had assumed the ring was the destination. It was never the destination. It was the instrument. This left one final question that took Thomas several minutes to fully form. If the ring had already completed its journey and been returned to Margaret years ago, why was she sending it back out now? Diane answered this part herself, her voice steady but full. Margaret had written to her 8 months earlier, around the time her diagnosis became serious, asking Diane to help her find someone new. Someone in crisis, someone who needed exactly the kind of unglamorous, undocumented, fiercely private care Margaret had spent her entire adult life quietly offering to people who would never make her famous for it. Diane reached into the box one final time and withdrew a separate folder Thomas hadn't noticed. Inside it were not letters from one relationship. There were threads of a dozen. A man in his 30s, whose rent Margaret had anonymously covered for 2 years after a layoff, traced through a community fund she had quietly administered under another name. A young mother she had mentored through a church program for 9 years without the woman ever learning her counselor's last name. A scholarship, funded privately, awarded annually to a graduating student chosen by criteria only Margaret had set, criteria that consistently selected the kids everyone else had given up on. Diane was not the destination Margaret had been pointing Thomas toward. She was a single node in something far larger, the keeper of one chapter in a life Thomas had shared a bed with for 41 years and had never once seen the full shape of. Diane handed him the final item in the box. A piece of paper? A name? A 19-year-old girl currently in foster care 2 towns over, identified through a school counselor Margaret had stayed in contact with for years, specifically, so this kind of handoff would always be possible. The chain had never stopped. It had only been waiting for its next link. Thomas drove home with the piece of paper on the passenger seat where the ring had been. He understood now what Margaret had actually asked of him in her final days, not to deliver an object. To become, even briefly and without fully understanding it at the time, a link in something that had been running beneath the surface of their entire marriage, never competing with it, never diminishing it, simply existing alongside it in a part of Margaret she had protected with the same fierce privacy she protected everything she genuinely loved. He had spent 41 years believing he knew the complete shape of his wife. He understood now that he had known her completely in every way that mattered. He had simply never known the full reach of her goodness, because she had built it specifically to be unknown. The title he had been carrying in his mind for 3 weeks, "My wife asked me to return her wedding ring to a stranger," no longer meant what he had believed it meant when he first heard it. The ring had never been going to a stranger. It had been going to the next person Margaret had already chosen to love, in the only way she had ever let herself be fully recognized for loving anyone. Quietly, anonymously, completely. Thomas picked up the piece of paper from the passenger seat, and understood, finally, that he was not closing his wife's story. He was opening the next page of it. He began driving toward the next address,